Another source of symbolic power was undoubtedly the crossing of the gateways. Pumapunku's name, the Cougar's Gate, captures some of the importance of gateways to the site. These remarkable stone structures, always carved like the gateway of the sun from a single piece of stone, were central to the stages of the ritual. The visitor may have passed through gates to enter the city, and again before crossing the moat, but he or she definitely passed through a gate at the base of Pumapunku, and again the first time he or she summited the complex before descending into the dark. The person would do so again before leaving the darkness and re-entering the daylight at the summit. For over a century, anthropologists of religion who have studied liminality have noted that the passage across the thresholds has been a central element in building a sense of liminality, or ending the liminal period, cross-culturally. Other examples include the Western tradition of a groom carrying a bride across the doorway when they first enter their home, or the Jewish mezuzah, a small prayer on a parchment rolled into a case that is attached to a doorframe of a Jewish home in the Ashkenazi tradition and is touched before entering or leaving. The architecture of Pumapunku, as well as the prominence of the gateway god as a liminal deity mediating the passage between elements of the ritual, shows how crucial this element was to Pumapunku. It is likely that the pilgrimage to Tiwanaku, with its emotional climax in a temple like Pumapunku, created and nurtured the sense of communitas amongst its participants. Pilgrims left their distant homes, an act of separation, and travelled a long distance together in a liminal state as pilgrims. They probably dressed, ate and spoke differently. Certainly they did not do their normal daily chores. Arriving at the sacred city, they deposited their lamas, offerings and travel goods, probably dressed themselves in special clothing, and perhaps performed acts of purification, and then crossed the sacred moat, a second act of separation. As they crossed the final gateway threshold of the temple of Pumapunku, they entered their deepest state of liminality, apparently leaving this world altogether. Here they faced demons and creatures of legend before emerging once again on the far side into the world they knew. As they stood on top of that pyramid, looking down upon the sacred mountains and lake at the Axis Mundi, center of the world, they would have felt the ultimate communitas. As Turner put it, a sense of harmony with the universe is made evident, and the whole planet is felt to be communitas. This moment is the ultimate goal of the entire pilgrimage. Myth and ritual undoubtedly reinforced each other mutually at Pumapunku as the structure of separation, liminality, reintegration that characterizes ritual also structures much of myth. While controversial, the scholar Joseph Campbell argued that most of the world's great myths follow the same narrative structure as the ritual, with the mythical hero separating from the world and undergoing trials before returning to the world with a boon that restores and improves the world. While it is unknown what kind of myths were related to the people of Tiwanaku, historians do know the tales their cultural descendants, the Inca, told. They spoke of Viracocha, a sun god, depicted as carrying two staves and surrounded sun rays, undoubtedly a deity connected to the Pan-Andean gateway god. Viracocha emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca, or a nearby cave. When he did so, he brought with him not only light, but all of the secrets of civilization. Facing great trials, he disguised himself as a beggar and wandered the world, bringing these gifts to all of humanity. It is likely that a myth very similar to this one fueled their beliefs of the Tiwanaku pilgrims, who saw themselves as walking in the footsteps of the gateway god as they descended into the dark and wet depths of Pumapunku, only to rise again from their own sacred isle to bring civilization to the far-flung corners of the Andes where they originated. Undoubtedly, those who participated, probably willingly, and even with great enthusiasm by the height of the city's power, left with a great sense of belonging to the official faith, of close ties to their fellow pilgrims, and belief in their own special status as returned pilgrims loyal to the faith. For the city's priestly managers, this system both drew in wealth in the form of offerings, which allowed for them to prosper despite not controlling any manufacturing or any armies of extortion, and it also protected and reinforced their standing, creating new generations of loyal followers. At the same time Tiwanaku flourished in the Titicaca Basin, another power was emerging to the north, in what is today central Peru. The great city of Huari, also written Huari, emerged as a classical imperial power, and it appears that the rulers of the city commanded armies, conquered and ruled their neighbors, established colonies, and supported a major population in their capital. This is in stark contrast to Tiwanaku, where the rulers appeared to have not exercised direct control, but instead commanded spiritual loyalty. It would appear at first glance that Tiwanaku was ripe for conquest by its expansionist, militaristic neighbor, but despite centuries of coexistence, this never happened. To the contrary, it appears that the two regions enjoyed different areas of influence and even overlapped at points. Much of this may be due to the fact that the elites of Wari also worshipped the staff god, which they probably adopted from the previous civilization of Chavan. For instance, Wari pottery and art of the time period show many of the same motifs, and clearly the same deity as that in Tiwanaku. It is possible that the people of Wari recognized the special status of Tiwanaku and respected its spiritual authority. A similar example might be seen in the complex relationship between centralized militaristic China and its neighbor, the decentralized spiritual Tibet. At times, the two were politically distinct and independent, and at other times, Tibet was a vassal of China, providing spiritual guidance in return for protection, while the Tibetans themselves dominated large areas of China without becoming Chinese. Nowhere is this relationship more enigmatic and interesting than in a site along the border of the two zones of influence, Cerro Ball. A terraced mountain fortress city, this strongpoint was built by Wari overlooking the Mokugua Valley, which was inhabited by people who appear to have been aligned with Tiwanaku. Both societies had elaborate irrigation technologies, and it appears that at Cerro Ball they shared water, allowing both communities to flourish side by side for a prolonged period. However, there is no evidence of one group conquering the other, nor is there evidence of extensive trade or economic connections between the two. This remarkable location shows that some accommodation was made between the elites of Wari and Tiwanaku. Tiwanaku was not like other great capitals of the world, and its eventual decline and disappearance also did not follow models seen elsewhere in the world. Tiwanaku did not fall to invasion, nor did its populace rebel or die of plagues or wars. Instead, it appears that the city simply began to slowly fade in prominence and relevance. This slow decline took centuries, and undoubtedly the Tiwanaku elites, with their mastery of perception and performance, hid this decline well for as long as possible. In retrospect, scholars believe that the beginning of the decline, the turning point in the community's fate, began in 562 CE, when the region began to experience a prolonged drought, which began a long, slow decline of the population of the basin. While arguments on the decline of ancient civilizations that hinge upon these people being mere puppets to their environment are at times troubling, and at worst, repeating racist presumptions about the helplessness of non-Europeans, in this case, one can observe how the Tiwanaku leadership was able to creatively and carefully adjust to changing circumstances and prolong their power for centuries of what was essentially a managed decline. At first, this drought may have actually accentuated Tiwanaku's power. The central settlement's raised agricultural fields were more resistant to drought, and many remained productive long after the surrounding lands had declined, which may have contributed to the myth of the city's blessed status. The decline may be masked by the long-standing tradition of deconstructing and reconstructing buildings. However, ultimately, Tiwanaku's power rested upon the willingness of people from distant lands to travel to the city and bring offerings with them. A decline in population or prosperity in these outlying regions would eventually be felt at Tiwanaku. One piece of evidence for the declining power of the centralized authorities in Tiwanaku was the fact that while the broader Tiwanaku-influenced cultural region continued to use ceramics, with Tiwanaku-inspired designs and motifs, these were increasingly produced locally and used an ever wider array of styles and interpretations. Centuries passed, and Tiwanaku's master planners could not have been oblivious to this decline. An example of their creative manipulation may have involved moving the Gateway of the Sun from its original location, perhaps at Pumapunku, to the central district at the edge of the Kalasasaya temple. This may have been an attempt to consolidate important artifacts in a smaller, more manageable area. Obviously, somebody believed in the sanctity of the city, but lacked the finance, technology, or knowledge to restore it to its original condition. By sacrificing Pumapunku and other outlying portions of the settlement to the status of picturesque ruin, the managers were apparently able to maintain the illusions for a while longer. Eventually, however, only so much can be sacrificed before there is nothing remaining. Thus, the settlement was not conquered or destroyed, but seemed to melt away, cannibalized by its own managers in their slow campaign to stave off the eventual decline. This process could only be carried on for so long before it became obvious to pilgrims, and when this happened, the illusion of Tiwanaku would be broken for those pilgrims. Perhaps when they returned home, they would convey their disappointments to their fellows, and fewer would come in the future, speeding up the end. By the time of the Inca, it is probable that the area was mostly ruin, with a small agricultural community and some very impressive ruins that attracted a few pilgrims, and maybe housed a few priests. This decline was probably complete by 1150 CE. Yet so much of the mythical status apparently remained, even after the end of the Golden Age. The patina of power and mystery remained. One enduring element of this myth was the special status of Lake Titicaca as the sacred site of the mythical creation of humanity. This tale persisted so strongly that it was fully adopted by the Inca centuries later as part of their own official theology, and continues in certain tales and practices in the region even today. As will be demonstrated later, the Inca themselves viewed Tiwanaku as a city built by the gods and gave it great respect. They, moreover, continued to worship the staff god under the name Viracocha. Finally, the region remained known for its stone masonry to the extent that the Inca transplanted masons from the basin to its capital in order to exploit their expertise. The decline of Tiwanaku did not involve a transformation of the ethnic makeup of the Titicaca Basin, at least not at first. The Pukina continued their mix of fishing the lakes, irrigated lakeside agriculture, and camelit-based pastoralism in the surrounding dry flatlands. Some significant settlements made by people culturally and politically similar to Tiwanaku, like Lukumata and Cochabamba, continue to be inhabited long after Tiwanaku itself faded, though they often shrunk in size. Lukumata, for example, no longer sat on a major pilgrimage route and returned to its earlier status as an agricultural village. Today, there is no significant settlement in the area, but the residents continue to practice subsistence agriculture. That quiet backwater status changed with the arrival of the Aymara. The Aymara people originated to the north of Titicaca, in what is today central Peru, where their distant cousins, who did not migrate south, today speak the related languages of Jakaru and Koki. A militant expansionist people, but not centrally organized under a single government or empire, the Proto-Aymarans left their homelands after the decline of Tiwanaku and Wari in the 1200s. Invading the Titicaca Basin, they apparently took advantage of the power vacuum to establish themselves. This was a time of great chaos in the Titicaca Basin, and it becomes evident that the fragmentation and violence accompanying the decline of the great powers and the invasion of the Aymara led to the peoples of the basin increasingly occupying dispersed settlements and fortified strongholds, which are locally referred to as pucaras. Over time, the Pukina were the losers of this contest of power. Today, there are only a handful of peoples who still exist, who are believed to descend from the builders of Tiwanaku. One group are the fascinating Uros people who live on Lake Titicaca, where they work as fisherfolk and build artificial islands made of reeds on the lake, which they view as sacred. While today they speak Aymara, they are distinct from their land-bound Aymara neighbors and refer to themselves as Lupihaks, or Sons of the Sun, perhaps a reference to the solar gateway god. Further from the original location of Tiwanaku are the Uru and Chipaya peoples, who live in the remote Sabaya province of Bolivia and to the east on the shores of Lake Pupo, and preserve ancient, distinctive traditions, including a lifestyle as fisherfolk. This dispersed Aymara domination of the region, never consolidated under a single government, eventually fell way to conquest by the mighty Incan Empire after 1470 CE. The Inca were a remarkably centralized, militarized empire that sought not only to conquer, but culturally homogenize the lands they conquered. Hence, they would often move populations around their empire to break down ethnic ties of people to particular regions. The Inca had a particular mythology which claimed that theirs was the first civilization, and when faced with a proof of the antiquity and skill of Tiwanaku's builders, they interpreted the city as being of divine origin. It appears that whatever remnants of Tiwanaku cultural memory existed when the Inca arrived were annihilated by their empire. Populations were moved out to work as stonemasons elsewhere. The Aymaraization of the population accelerated, and stories that contradicted official Incan myths were discouraged. By the arrival of the Spanish, there is no folkloric memory of the previous settlement, even in the Aymara town of Tiahuanaco, built over the top of it. This cultural and historic break, exacerbated by exporting local and importing more Aymara speakers, meant that the new local population's ancestors at most had visited ancient Tiwanaku as pilgrims, but did not have a relationship as inhabitants, priests, or staff of the site. That does not, however, mean that the Inca avoided or ignored the site. To the contrary, they appear to have celebrated the ancient ruins, re-inhabiting and adapting them to their own needs. While the original Tiwanaku was based around the sacred precinct around the Acapana pyramid, the Inca instead favored Pumapunku. The Inca radically reorganized the sacred space around Pumapunku, creating at least 5 distinct activity areas and transforming it from an entirely sacred space to a combined administrative center, palace and temple. The Inca integrated the site into their own network of huaca capture and appear to have treated the place with great reverence. This reverence is seen nowhere more than in the fact that when the Spanish conquered the Incan capital of Cusco, itself viewed as a sacred city and the center of the universe, the last Incan emperor established a short-lived capital at Tiwanaku to challenge Spanish power from the site of obvious symbolic power and strategic position. Certainly, the social structures and populations established by the Inca remain relatively unbroken, though not unconverted and unconquered, all the way to the present-day community. Spiritually, it appears that the Inca inherited much of the Andean cosmology that has been promoted by Tiwanaku, and presumably Wari. For example, the most important god of the Inca, the founder of their empire and ancestor to their rulers, was Viracocha. He was depicted almost identically to that of the gateway staff god, facing forward and carrying 2 staffs with the rays of the sun radiating from his head. This myth had an even stronger connection to the Tiwanaku legacy. Viracocha was said to have been born out of either the waters of or a cave nearby Lake Titicaca. In addition to being the life-giving god of the sun, he also brought civilization with him. These tales were recorded by the Spanish, who documented the Incan religion even as they sought to destroy it, but one can undoubtedly read the echoes of Tiwanaku into this. The entire architecture of Tiwanaku, the roofed semi-subterranean temples, damp with the carefully collected and channeled rainwater, ending in stairways rising up to the glorious summit of the Acapana, where the pilgrim is bathed in sunlight, and the view of the basin, were most likely the ritual accompaniments to these same myths. Pilgrims could be like the divine savior, emerging from their own caves and returning to their communities filled with the mysteries of the lakeside fantasy land. It is thanks to the Incan dedication to these shared pan-Andean myths that they have survived to this day. Unlike other famed South American ruins, like Machu Picchu in Peru or the Ciudad Perdida in Colombia, Tiwanaku was never lost and rediscovered. The presence of the vibrant town of Tiahuanaco amongst the ruins, even using them as building material, especially for their church, meant that from the very first arrival of the Spanish, they were commented on. The first written account of the area and the ruins comes from the Spanish conquistador Pedro de Cieza de Leon from his book The Travels of Pedro de Cieza de Leon, A.D. 1532 to 1550, published in 1883, which is quoted in the opening introduction to this text. The buildings of at least the Pumapunku were still in use at the time of the conquest, and all of them were in much better shape than they are today. Diego de Alcobaza, a Spanish Catholic priest, noted during his 16th century visit to the ruins that the walls, roofs, floor, and doorways are all of one single piece carved out of a rock, and the walls of the court and of the hall are 3/4 of a yard in breadth. The roof of the hall, though it appears to be thatch, is really of stone. They have combed and carved the stone so that it resembles a roof of thatch. Despite the fact that these buildings were obviously constructed of masterful ability and were the grandest in the region, the Spanish sought to break the connection between administration of government and what they viewed as pagan and satanic monuments. Therefore, while they marveled at the ruins, there is no evidence that they inhabited or used them except as convenient sources of stone. The products, a broad-paved central town plaza and gated church, the only Catholic church in Bolivia with stone gateways over all of the entries to its courtyard, are evidence of this cannibalistic architectural reuse. Civic life migrated approximately a kilometer north and west from the pre-Columbian center. Attention to the pre-Columbian ruins of Latin America, both inside and beyond the region, began to increase dramatically in the early 20th century due to the discovery of Machu Picchu by Hiram Bingham in 1911 and the pro-indigenous, nationalist Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1920. Tiwanaku had the distinct advantage of being eminently accessible just outside of La Paz when compared to the epic expedition sent to find Mayan, Olmec, and Incan ruins in formidable locations. Unfortunately, this meant that Tiwanaku was already looted of any remaining treasures by the time archaeologists arrived. The ruins have therefore not produced the remarkable artifacts of gold, silver, and precious stones that have attracted so much attention elsewhere in the continent, and the museum at Tiwanaku is mostly home to an impressive ceramics collection. Scholarly work at the site had begun hesitantly in the 19th century. An American antiquarian named Ephraim George Squire visited and mapped the site in the 1860s, and a small German expedition toured and documented it in the 1890s. Archaeologists began to visit with greater frequency and intensity in the early 20th century, including Arthur Poznański in 1903 and Stig Ryden in the 1940s. However, scientific excavation was still in its infancy, and most of this early work was in the form of surveys and general description. It is likely that these archaeologists, themselves little more than looters working for museums, knew that Tiwanaku's golden treasures were long gone. At the same time, the Bolivian state was also becoming increasingly aware of the importance of its pre-Columbian heritage and the value of remarkable sites like Tiwanaku. An easy day trip from La Paz, it began attracting more and more visitors, both domestic and international, and is today frequently ranked as one of the top locations in the entire country. As was the case for centuries in one form or another, the villagers of Tiwanaku have become increasingly dependent upon visitors to the site for their livelihood, and there has been a growth in tourist infrastructure, 2 museums, hotels, hostels, restaurants, etc. As the second half of the 20th century dawned, Bolivia was in turmoil, and in 1952 the indigenous peoples of the nation rose up in the Bolivian National Revolution. The resulting government instituted massive social reforms which empowered indigenous peoples, including the residents of Tiwanaku. When archaeologists returned in 1957, and there has been a continual archaeological project at Tiwanaku ever since, the 23 Aymara kinship groups in the surrounding community had negotiated amongst themselves to equally distribute the valuable positions on the dig crews, with provisions made for seniority. This process has also meant that the entire community has been active participants in the archaeology, as well as the tourism generated by the site, and has given some measure of protection for archaeologists and their work from the various political upheavals that have occurred since. Likewise, this recognition of the importance and value of the site has meant that local people are more likely to turn in looters than become them. In fact, during a 2001 indigenous uprising, armed Aymara militants, who saw it as part of their ethnic heritage, occupied the site in order to protect it from possible looters taking advantage of the chaos. The first serious long-term archaeological project in the community began in the 1970s and was conducted by 2 archaeologists, Oswaldo Rivera and Alan Colata, a Bolivian and American respectively. They focused on the Acapana and the Sacred Precinct, while others were left to dig Pumapunku later. Archaeology is a long-term process, and it took decades before they were able to synthesize this information in Colata's 1993 history, The Tiwanaku, Portrait of an Andean Civilization. While Rivera and Colata did solid, vitally important preliminary work, they were unable to fully comprehend the unique nature of the city. The assumption was that the traditional elements of ancient city life, vast residential neighborhoods, industry, political centralization, and military complexes were not absent, but simply had not been uncovered yet. This is one of the challenges for archaeology, determining what was actually present or not present at a site, versus what remains under the soil yet to be discovered. The contemporary understanding of Tiwanaku, not so much as a city, but as a Vatican Disney center for pilgrimage, based upon an economy of religious offerings, and populated not by a city's worth of citizens, but by a small staff, came not from Riviera and Colata, but from the next generation of archaeologists. In particular, the most significant excavator and analyst who brought about the radical change in thinking about the site was Alexei Vranic. His revolutionary 1999 doctoral dissertation ignited new debates about the site, and he brought new computer spatial mapping techniques to the site, culminating in Vranic and Stanish 2013. He has continued to be important since then, and today teaches at UCLA. Regardless of how it was interpreted, Tiwanaku became central to the Bolivian national identity, entering into the standard national curriculum and visited yearly by countless Bolivian schoolchildren. In 1986, the new 200 Bolivianos note, the largest denomination of the national currency, was drawn up to depict the monuments of Tiwanaku on its reverse, further cementing its presence in the national imagination. It is the only pre-Columbian theme on any Bolivian currency. In addition to this understandable enthusiasm and pride in the site, Tiwanaku has also attracted some unwanted attention over the last 60 years. One problem has been the restoration of the site by well-meaning guardians. A number of walls have been rebuilt and monuments repaired in ways that have only dubious basis in archaeological fact and run counter to the general reticence of archaeologists to attempt any reconstruction. Beyond Bolivia, Tiwanaku has also attracted the attention of numerous pseudo-scientific thinkers, especially many individuals arguing for an extraterrestrial origin of the site. Much of this attention has been particularly directed at Pumapunku, which has been said to be the extraterrestrial United Nations. The host of the television show Ancient Aliens said, "Pumapunku is the only site on planet Earth that, in my opinion, was built directly by extraterrestrials. It is unfortunate that these theories have emerged even as our understanding of not only how Pumapunku was fashioned, but also why the human beings who made it did so and what it meant for them." The story of Tiwanaku, with its remarkable connections, not to the stars, but to the landscape around it, the sacred waters of Titicaca, and the islands and mountains, which inspired untold pilgrims for centuries, is only now becoming revealed to us. The pseudoscience, often not only wrong in its interpretations, but in fact in its basic facts, threatens to drown out the real, fascinating, and thoroughly human story. There are many questions that remain for future scholars studying this location, but it is hardly as mysterious or unexplainable as proponents of these theories proclaim. The sculpted tenon heads are evocative, but are clearly connected to the Huaca capture tradition found elsewhere in the Andes, before and after. The incredible stone carving is testament to the skill and knowledge of the builders, but certainly did not require paranormal technology to accomplish. Tiwanaku gained the ultimate recognition of any ancient site in 2000 when it was added to the list of World Heritage Sites by the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, meaning that it is part of the shared patrimony of humanity. UNESCO 2014. It is a shame that in their zealousness to find aliens under every carved rock, the alien astronaut writers have essentially tried to steal a piece of the shared humanity from all of us and attribute it to fanciful visitors from distant galaxies. Hopefully, in the future, we will have enough respect for our ancestors to recognize their genius in a place like Tiwanaku, a place that is astonishing for what it tells us about humanity and our desire to be awed, to be humbled, and to enjoy a good performance. At the same time, Tiwanaku has always been a place of illusions and myths, and it should be no surprise that our modern mythologies have taken root here as well.